morning. Thank you for staying up with us for Weather Extra. I'm meteorologist Jillian Grace. From a hurricane making an historic landfall to a strong cold front bringing a big chill, not only right here at home but across the nation, it sure was a wild week of weather across the country. And we begin Weather Extra tonight with one of our top weather stories of the week, that strong cold front that brought us much needed rain and a taste of winter. The strongest cold front of the season moved into central Texas on Friday, bringing us the coldest temperatures we've seen in over 230 days and also a lot of hail. Check out this video of hail plunging into Sammy Hale's backyard in Salado, tearing down leaves everywhere. And this view of heavy rain and hail in Belton, sent into KWTX from Sarah Braun. All of this hail, tiny in size but accumulating on the ground, looking like snow on the grass and driveway. And here's another view of a ton of tiny hail collecting on Kay Taylor's yard in Stillhouse Hollow. And also check out all of that rain on the ground as well. That is a very nice sight to see. And here's some $half size hail that fell in Belton. Thanks to Amber Winter for sending us this picture. And so much hail fell in Lampasas that it was coming out of this gutter and piled up on the ground. Thanks to Mike Wiley for sending us this picture. We thankfully only saw beneficial rain from that storm system, but it was a very different situation to our north and out to our west. Take a look. Heavy snow was brought to California, Sierra Nevada, and other parts of the Mountain West early last week as a cold front moved in from the Pacific. The great news is that this winter storm looks like it could be one of California's most significant November storms in recent years, replenishing mountain snowpack and effectively ending the fire season across the Golden State. A major winter storm unfolded in the northern plains late in the week. Winter weather advisories and winter storm warnings were in place over parts of the central and northern Rockies. Ice storm and blizzard warnings were in effect for the Dakotas and parts of Minnesota due to heavy snow and high winds, which significantly reduced visibility and made travel very treacherous. Across the northern plains, some saw up to 2 feet of snow along with freezing rain and sleet in other parts. This was the first blizzard of the season for the U.S. And although we had a few severe storms roll through with this past cold front, it was nothing like the front that moved through our region back on November 4th, causing widespread severe weather not too far away. The first major tornado outbreak of autumn took place Friday, November 4th into the early morning hours of Saturday, as a cold front swept south across the southern plains, producing numerous tornadoes. There was nearly 50 reports of tornado damage across northeastern Texas, southeastern Oklahoma, western Arkansas, and northwestern Louisiana. Catastrophic damage followed as large, destructive tornadoes ripped through towns, prompting tornado emergencies for 2 communities. 2 fatalities occurred in Texas from tornadoes, with one in Oklahoma and another there due to someone drowning. Over 24 injuries were also reported. Hundreds of homes, barns, and businesses were damaged or destroyed. Trees were snapped or uprooted, and power lines were blown over, making many heartbreaking scenes as these tornadoes passed through. And meteorologist Sean Bellifury joins us now to bring more details on where these tornadoes formed and the tornado outbreak, or rather how that tornado outbreaks compares to others in history.
The southern plains have been plagued with cold fronts pretty much every single Friday for the past couple of weeks, but it was the November 4th storms that produced a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and even parts of Louisiana. The seeds of that tornado outbreak actually started here. These are the tracks for the November 4th tornadoes just about 10 or so days ago. Now, the strongest tornadoes, one moved through Red River County and one moved through Lamar County, and it was a Lamar County tornado that briefly produced EF4 damage, 170-mile-per-hour winds. The storm that produced that strong tornado got started in Hill County. The first tornado warning of the day for that storm came out just a little bit after 2:30 in the afternoon. And once that storm got farther to the north, that's really where it got into the best upper level dynamics. A lot of diverging air allowing these storms to really grow. Kaufman County is really where it started to take off, and then it did, of course, produce the strong tornado in Red River and also into Lamar County. Now, if you follow the weather with any sort of frequency, you may kind of see a similarity between another tornado event, and that was the December 26, 2015 tornadoes. The tornado that started, or the storm that started just west of Hillsborough in Hill County, eventually went on to produce an EF4 tornado just east of Dallas. You can actually see that storm just to the west of Hillsborough during the late afternoon time period, eventually moving into Ellis County and Dallas County, becoming that EF4 monster. Reporting in the studio, Sean Bellafury, KWTX News 10.
The other major weather story this past week was Hurricane Nicole, making an historic landfall in Florida. Nicole formed as a subtropical storm in the southwestern Atlantic back on November 7th, becoming the 14th named storm and 8th hurricane of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. The storm would make its first landfall as a strong tropical storm on November 9th on the Great Abaco Islands of the Bahamas, and only several hours after that, making landfall in the Grand Bahama Islands as a Category 1 hurricane with sustained winds of 75 miles per hour. Nicole is historic. It was the first November named storm to make landfall in the Bahamas in 15 years, and the hurricane with the latest landfall in a calendar year to strike Florida's Atlantic coast since 1935. The storm made landfall just south of Vero Beach, Florida, early Thursday, November 10th, still with Category 1 strength with 75-mile-per-hour winds. NASA's new moon rocket, Artemis 1, reportedly experienced 100-mile-per-hour winds at Cape Canaveral, Florida on Wednesday night as Nicole took aim at the Sunshine State. Nicole brought major impacts such as coastal flooding, beach erosion, heavy rain, and gusty winds, not only to Florida but along much of the eastern seaboard into the weekend. Land in several homes along Florida's east coast collapsed and washed away into the Atlantic as the influx of water from Nicole flooded coastal areas. Nicole eventually weakened, moving overland across Florida, but then emerged back into the Gulf of Mexico and then moved into Florida's Panhandle and then traveled further north into Georgia and the Carolinas. Nicole continued to weaken across the southeastern U.S. and eventually emerged with the cold front over the mid-Atlantic states as the week came to a close. Straight ahead on Weather Extra, we dive into the latest drought monitor. Stick with us.
And welcome back to Weather Extra. Even though we've had some good recent rain over the last couple of weeks, unfortunately, the drought monitor really hasn't responded across Central Texas. We are still dealing with a large portion of Central Texas under extreme drought and still dealing with exceptional drought between Gatesville and Killeen. Really, right over Fort Hood is the area with the worst drought. Typically, even when we do see rain, it's a delayed effect for that rain to really soak in and help the overall drought conditions, and we're still sitting well below normal for our overall rainfall amounts. Now, area lakes continue to be very low, but there is a little sliver of good news. We've actually seen Lake Whitney come up a little bit, and while Lake Waco, Lake Belton, and Stillhouse have been dropping a little bit, they're not as bad as they have been. And again, that's the effects that the recent rain has had. Now, drought's still a major story all across the country, particularly along and west of the Mississippi River, where drought conditions across the plains, down into Texas, and more out into the desert southwest and into parts of California as well. Jillian?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Brady. That drought is creating a water crisis on the country's most famous river. Senior national and environmental correspondent Ben Tracy shows us what is being done to help keep the Mississippi River flowing, although sinking to record level lows.
This used to be an island in the middle of the Mississippi River, reachable only by boat. Now you can walk to what's known as Tower Rock. Months of below normal rainfall have sent the river to record low levels, creating chaos for barge traffic.
We haven't seen these levels for about 3 decades.
Paul Rohde represents the river shipping and towing industry. Barges are being slowed and stranded at the worst possible time, just as farmers are sending their harvests downriver.
60% of our ag exports travel right down here, the Mississippi River, down to New Orleans and out for export. So if we don't have barges available, that's a real problem, not just for America's farmers, but for the world, frankly.
It's also a critical supply chain for everything from coal and petroleum to fertilizer and road salt.
How important is this river to moving goods around this country?
The Mississippi River is a vital transportation artery. It's absolutely a water superhighway. Annually, we'll move 500 million tons, give or take. If you wanted to put that on trucks, you could circle the earth 13 times with trucks bumper to bumper.
Billions of dollars in economic losses and higher prices for consumers are expected as the drought drags on.
What's your biggest concern?
No clouds, no rain.
And you need more than a little rain.
A lot more.
Lou Del Arco is Chief of Operations for the Army Corps of Engineers in St. Louis. The city is now the gateway to growing problems downriver. The Army Corps has been dredging nonstop for 3 months, desperately trying to keep a 9-foot deep shipping channel open by sucking up enough silt and sand to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool every hour.
If this drought continues, can you dredge your way out of this?
We can dredge it to a certain point, and then Mother Nature wins.
In Louisiana, salt water from the Gulf of Mexico is creeping up the river, threatening the drinking water supply. Baton Rouge has a new tourist attraction. A sunken ferry boat from the early 1900s resurfaced as the water receded. This punishing drought comes as climate change is making rainfall patterns all over the country more extreme.
It is drought or flood.
Washington University professor Robert Criss has studied the Mississippi's flow for decades.
Was your sense that this is not going to be as reliable as we thought it once was?
It clearly is not reliable. When the water's too high, they can't run the barges. When the water's too low, they can't run the barges.
And yet the barges have to keep running on a not-so-mighty Mississippi.
Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. This is irreplaceable. We have got to keep commerce moving.
Ben Tracy, CBS News.
Welcome back to Weather Extra. Autumn has been in full swing across the country with leaves changing colors, especially now right here at home. Peak fall colors have already taken place over majority of the country, but we're actually seeing our peak happening right now into the south, and we'll continue to actually see this trend carry on until the end of the month. But you may have noticed our trees have not been as colorful this year, and experts say you can blame that on the lack of rainfall. But as leaves change color here at home and also across the country, you may be wondering why certain leaves change to the certain color. Well, Dan Smith has the answer in your Moment of Science.
Nature's fireworks are on full display across many parts of the country right now and barely at all in others. Here's a primer on the how and why behind your favorite fall color changes. Chlorophyll is in every green plant you see. It's not the only ingredient in leaves, but it's how they make food from sunlight through photosynthesis. More sunlight in the summer months means those leaves stay nice and green. Suddenly, here comes that fall chill and less sunlight too. A layer of cells cuts off leaf nutrients at the stem. The remaining chlorophyll in the leaf is broken down and eventually used up entirely before that leaf falls. But it's what that lack of chlorophyll reveals that makes for those flashy forest scenes. There are other types of pigments in leaves after all. Carotenoids are produced in plant cells during the growing season, same as chlorophyll. That's what gives you your yellow and orange colors to those fall leaves, plus food like bananas, corn, and, well, carrots. It's right there in the name. Anthocyanins are your red, blue, and purple-hued natural features. They're only made in leaves during the fall as they take advantage of excess sugars. But year-round, they're found in red apples, cherries, blueberries, and the like. Also a good anti-inflammatory for us humans. Leaves change color while they're still attached to the tree, and for good reason. The tree conserves and reabsorbs that energy. When things warm up again, the growing leaves can then regenerate that broken down chlorophyll, or for remaining leaves in fall, turn just a little bit greener for a last hurrah in the waning weeks of the season. Waning sunlight is kind of inevitable, but local weather patterns play a major role in peak fall color. Your best bet lies with warm, dry, and sunny days coupled with cool and crisp nights, as long as it stays above freezing. Summer drought can also delay that peak by a few weeks. Final safety note, if you're going out leaf peeping this weekend, at 40 miles an hour, it would take you about 80 feet to stop a car. Wet roads double that stopping distance, and wet leaf-covered roads are more than triple. Hands on the wheel and eyes on the road, no matter how lovely that view off to the side may be. For this week's Moment of Science, I'm Dan Smith.
Across the country, a deforestation crisis reaches its breaking point, but officials are rolling out a massive and ambitious plan to combat this. Jeremy Roth has more.
The annual arrival of autumn colors across the land is a reminder not only of the living beauty of America's forests, but also the vulnerability of this natural resource, which now more than ever is fighting for its very survival. Wildfires are responsible for the destruction of millions of acres of forested land in the U.S. It's a problem that David Lytle of the U.S. Forest Service says has reached a breaking point.
We are facing a wildfire crisis in the U.S. Wildfires are growing in both size and intensity. They're becoming more difficult to fight. And as a result of wildfires and our limited resources, we end up with a backlog of about 5 million acres of land on National Forest System lands that are in need of reforestation.
Now, seeds of hope in the form of federal legislation called the Replant Act that couldn't have come at a more pivotal time. The bipartisan act not only delivers a much-needed infusion of funds and resources, but also sets an ambitious goal of planting and regenerating more than 1 billion new trees on U.S. soil over the next decade.
Replant has been a game changer and is really going to allow us to address the wildland fire risk issues, to address climate change, and to address our reforestation backlog.
But more than 1 billion trees? How exactly is a monumental task like that executed?
We will be expanding our operations, hiring new people, and doing more work on the ground. Moving forward is going to take collaboration, cooperation, and partnership.
So what can the rest of us do to help?
You can plant a tree in your own yard. You can work with your community to help plant trees in communities. You can work with nonprofit organizations. You can volunteer. All of us have a role to play in reforestation.
I'm Jeremy Roth, reporting.
We've talked about weather here on Earth, but did you know there's weather in space too? Coming up next, Dr. Trey Cade explains space weather to us in this week's Degrees of Science.
Tell me, we talked about space weather and here we are on Earth, a little bit more about, here we are in central Texas and we're so far away from space, it seems like, kind of some of those impacts for us locally on space weather and how that interacts with our daily lives.
Yeah, because some of those things, while the phenomena that are happening are in space, they can definitely affect some of the things that are happening, on the ground. In our country and affect like our national infrastructure and things like that. So there are several types of emissions and things that come off of the sun that interact with the Earth. And that's really what space weather is about, is kind of that sun-Earth interaction. And of course people know that the sun emits light. But that's really, for some people, that's kind of the extent of what they know about what's coming off of the sun. And there's really so much more, because especially when we get things like solar flares that happen, these huge explosive releases of energy on the sun. So when that happens, we get these very strong emissions of electromagnetic radiation, X-rays, radio waves, things like that. That when those arrive at the Earth can cause problems, disruptions for our technology, mostly space technology and things like that, as well as disrupting communication systems. We also can get releases of high energy particle radiation, essentially high energy protons traveling at close to the speed of light. So when those hit anything, whether it's a satellite or an astronaut or a pilot or a passenger on an airliner even flying at high altitudes, because these things can penetrate into the atmosphere, they can deposit radiation and increase radiation dosages. So when you get a lot of that happening, that can cause human health issues, especially with long-term exposures to multiple events.
Sure.
Like that. And then the other thing that can happen is with a solar flare, oftentimes you get a big release of a giant cloud of magnetic gas that we call a coronal mass ejection. Those hit the Earth. That creates a huge disruption in the Earth's magnetic field, and we call that a magnetic storm or a geomagnetic storm. And geomagnetic storms can have huge impacts to surface technology, especially power systems. So that's when we start to look at effects on like the power grid, disruptions to the power grid, potential for widespread blackouts, things like that happening. Mostly the most vulnerable areas in the U.S. are going to be mostly in the kind of the northern half of the U.S.
Okay,
so
why
the
is
southern
that?
half, because a lot of the disruptions are associated with kind of the regions where the aurora borealis is strong, and so that's in the more northern parts.
Sure.
It kind of makes an oval around the North Pole, but as magnetic storms get stronger, that oval expands, and so you can get aurora. So, for example, during very large magnetic storms, you can see the aurora in Texas.
Yes,
even, and that happens. That happens about once every 10 years or so.
I've never seen it, but I've heard.
We'll get a large enough storm where you can see it in Texas, actually. And so when you get that magnitude of a storm, those impacts can even spread into the southern U.S. So you start to look at more vulnerable areas where the power grid is more vulnerable. A lot of it also has to do with because there are reliances upon, like there's conductivity and a lot of kind of sciencey details like that, where there tends to be more of those kinds of issues in the northern part of the U.S. as well, where there's conductivity is more conducive to helping kind of magnify the effects of a magnetic storm as well, whereas that's less conducive situation in kind of the southern U.S. and especially kind of the south where we are. But doesn't mean those impacts can't still happen if we get a large enough magnetic storm. Yeah. For example, there was and so these things have happened. These aren't just theoretical. There was a very large storm. In fact, the largest storm we've measured in modern times was in March of 1989.
Okay.
And that one caused a huge blackout in Canada. And the entire province of Quebec was without power.
Okay.
For many millions of people for several hours were without power, and there was a power outage induced by this very large magnetic storm. And so the concern is for storms that magnitude or even larger, which we know even larger storms can happen, that you could see large kind of cascading blackouts over large parts of the U.S., especially in the northwest and the northeastern parts of the U.S., which seem to be the most vulnerable parts of our power grid.
To catch this full interview, go to kwtx.com/degreesofscience or scan the QR code on your screen and it will take you to our YouTube page. We'll be right back.
That's all we have for you tonight. Make sure to dress warm and have your umbrellas ready to go tomorrow. Good night. Have a great week.